Welcome back to the dark side of the frequency, night travelers. This is Disaster, broadcasting live across the digital airwaves, pushing our signal through the dead air to wherever you've pulled your heavy rigs off the shoulder and into the pitch black. Tonight, we are opening the long-haul files wide with a massive collection of 7 brutal, terrifying encounters recorded by veteran truck drivers who faced horrors most people wouldn't dare whisper about. If you are out on the open road right now, lock your cab doors, check your side mirrors, and keep both hands on the wheel, because every single word tonight comes straight from the driver's seat. Our opening nightmare brings us to the barren desert stretches along the Arizona and New Mexico border, on a freezing midnight back in the winter of 1978. My name is Mateo Morales, and I was a seasoned long-haul trucker who genuinely believed he had seen every dark, twisted corner these desolate highways had to offer. I accepted an extraordinary late-night run for triple my standard dispatcher rate, taking delivery of a heavy box truck at an abandoned, unlit industrial yard on the muddy outskirts of Tucson. The contract conditions written into my paperwork were absolute, uncompromising, and deeply unsettling. Haul 3 massive oak crates across state lines, never expose the cargo bay to ambient heat, and under no circumstances break the thick white wax seals stamped directly over the steel securing bolts. Stenciled prominently across the front of each box in bold black lettering was a stark warning that read, "Pathological Institute specimens, highly sensitive lab experiments, do not expose to heat." I pulled heavy on the door handle, climbed into the high cab, and threw the stick into gear to roll out into the night. The heavy diesel engine hummed a low, rhythmic vibration that resonated through the floorboards and directly into the soles of my boots, while the dull amber glow of the dashboard gauges fought valiantly against the absolute desert blackness outside. For 2 solid hours, the highway was completely dead, just endless miles of loose sand, twisted cactus shadows, and freezing winter wind whipping mercilessly against the side glass. The money sitting in my coat pocket was the only thing keeping my mind focused as the dark asphalt stretched into infinity ahead of me. Then, without warning, a choking, deeply nauseating stench began creeping through the vents of the cab. It wasn't engine grease, burnt wiring, or standard chemical disinfectant, it was a heavy, suffocating mixture of burning formalin, damp graveyard soil, and cold, metallic blood. I coughed, rolling down my driver's window an inch to catch fresh air, but the foul odor only thickened inside the tight space. Moments later, the silence of the drive was shattered as heavy, muffled sounds began echoing from the refrigerated cargo bay directly behind my seat, a dry, dragging scrape, like something weighing hundreds of pounds moving slowly and deliberately across the cold floorboards. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as I tried to convince myself it was just loose cargo shifting on the rough asphalt. But my eyes kept darting back to the small rearview mirror, watching the dark walls separating my seat from the cargo hold, wondering what had just woken up in the dark. The dashboard lights flickered faintly as the needle on the temperature gauge dipped lower into the freezing zone. The dragging sound behind my seat stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind an absolute, oppressive silence that felt far more terrifying than the noise itself. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands on the leather-wrapped wheel, but at precisely 3:20 a.m., a harsh red warning light on my console flashed violently to life, refrigeration oil pressure drop, cargo at risk. I slammed my foot onto the air brakes, bringing the 40-ton box truck to a skidding, violent halt along the gravel shoulder of the deserted highway. The hiss of the air brakes died down, leaving only the dull, idling rumble of the diesel engine cutting through the freezing desert air. I grabbed my heavy iron flashlight from the glove compartment, pulled my coat collar up around my neck, and unlatched the heavy driver's side door. The midnight air hit my face like a blast of liquid ice, freezing the moisture in my nostrils instantly as my boots crunched onto the frosted sand. I walked around to the rear of the vehicle, the beam of my flashlight shaking against the dark metal plating of the cargo doors. I unlatched the heavy steel padlocks, pulled the locking bar down, and swung the rear doors open into the pitch-black, ice-cold interior of the cargo bay. A thick, foggy vapor rolled out of the open doors, carrying that same nauseating stench of formalin, wet earth, and fresh copper blood. I stepped up onto the metal bumper, swinging the flashlight beam across the dark room until the light landed squarely on the 3 oak crates. My heart slammed against my ribs, stopping cold as I saw the middle container. The thick white wax seal stamped across the front had been violently cracked and shattered from the inside out, splintering the oak frame. Long, jagged tears shredded the heavy plastic lining beneath the wood, and a dark, viscous fluid was slowly dripping from the seams, pooling onto the steel floorboards. I stepped closer, my heavy boots sliding slightly on the wet metal surface, and raised the beam of light to the small glass observation pane built into the lid of the box. I wiped away a thick layer of icy condensation with my thumb, leaned my head forward, and pressed my eye directly against the freezing glass. The bright beam illuminated a horrific, frozen nightmare inside that completely shattered my sanity in a fraction of a second. Inside the crate lay a fully intact human body, a young woman with pale, blue-veined skin, her wide, unblinking eyes staring directly into mine with a motionless, milky glaze. Beside her, crammed tightly into the narrow wooden space, was the body of a man whose chest bore deep, raw surgical incisions that had been violently torn open from within. Before I could even draw a breath to scream, the dead woman's chest suddenly heaved with a sharp, ragged gasp of cold air. Her pale eyelids twitched, and her cold, blue fingers flexed, her long, sharpened nails rising to scratch furiously against the inner wooden wall. A deep, inhuman sigh echoed out from the cracks in the wood, filling the small cargo bay like a draft blowing straight from an open grave. I stumbled backward in sheer terror, slipping on the wet floor and dropping my flashlight into the pooling blood. Before I could scramble to my feet and jump out into the desert sand, the massive rear doors slammed shut with a deafening, thunderous metallic crash. Up front, the starter motor whined, the heavy diesel engine roared into a furious RPM, and the truck accelerated violently forward into the absolute darkness, trapping me inside a rolling tomb with breathing corpses. The freezing wind shifts, carrying us far away from the desert sand and up into the towering, snow-choked peaks of the Colorado Rockies. My name is Arthur Vance, and back in the bitter winter of 1982, I was hauling a double-trailer load across the mountain pass during a blinding blizzard that killed visibility completely. The storm hit without warning around 10 at night, turning the narrow highway into a wide-out wall where the headlights reflected straight back into my eyes like a blinding sheet of frosted glass. Snow battered the windshield in a relentless, icy flurry, and every single ounce of my focus went into shifting through low gears to keep 40 tons of steel from sliding over the sheer drop-offs into the black abyss below. The heat inside the cab was cranking at full blast, but the mountain frost was so aggressive that thin, geometric ice patterns kept crawling up the corners of my side windows. The diesel engine roared under the strain of the steep incline, its heavy vibration rattling the steering column as I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. Around 2 in the morning, near mile marker 38, a stretch of road famous for horrific winter fatal collisions, my high beams caught a faint shape through the swirling white chaos ahead. It was a figure kneeling right on the icy shoulder, wearing a heavy, snow-covered canvas coat, raising a weak, trembling arm to signal for help. On a night like that, staying outside for more than 15 minutes meant guaranteed hypothermia, and the unwritten code of the highway wouldn't let me leave a fellow driver to freeze to death. I geared down, pulled the heavy rig onto the gravel shoulder with a long hiss of the air brakes, and popped the passenger door open to let the freezing stranger into the warmth of the cab. I heard the heavy, wet rustle of his thick coat as he pulled himself up the high metal steps, and the entire right side of the cab dipped noticeably under his weight. I kept my eyes locked on the air brake valve for a second, pulling my gloves back on, saying loudly over the roar of the heater, "You picked a hell of a night to get stranded out here, buddy. Slide on in." There was no reply, just the howling wind outside and a sudden, unnatural silence that swallowed the noise of the engine. I turned my head to look at the passenger seat, expecting to see a half-frozen traveler shaking off the snow, but my heart stopped dead in my chest. The passenger seat was completely empty. There was no snow on the vinyl cushion, no wet mud on the floorboards, and the heavy passenger door was shut tight against the blizzard. Yet, as I stared at the blank seat in sheer disbelief, the temperature inside the cab dropped so fast that my breath turned into a thick cloud of ice right before my eyes. The heater vents were still blowing hot air, but the cabin felt colder than the mountain peak outside. Suddenly, a heavy, crushing weight pressed directly down on my left shoulder, as if someone made of solid ice were standing right behind my seat, leaning over me. The vinyl of my seat creaked under the invisible pressure, and before I could reach for the door latch to jump out, a dry, raspy whisper crawled straight into my left ear. "Your trip ends right here, Arthur, and you're never stepping out of this truck again." The freezing pressure on my shoulder locked my muscles in place, keeping me pinned against the steering wheel while the ghost's icy breath crystallized into thick frost against my neck. My lungs burned as I tried to force air into my chest, but the weight leaning over my seat felt as heavy as a block of granite. The cab of my truck, warm moments before, had transformed into a freezing tomb coated in geometric ice. My knuckles turned white as I forced my foot down onto the accelerator, sending a desperate jolt of power through the transmission to break free from the icy paralysis gripping the cab. The heavy rig lurched forward into the white storm, its massive tires slipping on black ice before catching traction to drag 40 tons of steel up the winding mountain pass. The engine screamed in protest, its roar echoing off sheer rock faces as snow battered the glass in a relentless frenzy. Miraculously, as the truck breached the crest of the ridge and crossed into the valley, the crushing weight suddenly vanished from my shoulder like phantom mist, leaving behind a sharp cold that took minutes to thaw from my skin. I didn't dare look back at the empty passenger seat, nor did I check the side mirrors as the mountain road sloped downward into safety. I kept my foot pressed flat on the pedal until I pulled into the lit parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop at the base of the mountain, where I sat in a booth for 3 hours, staring blankly into a mug of black coffee and vowing never to drive the Colorado Rockies in winter again. The mountain storm fades into silence as the frequency shifts south, moving across the sun-bleached expanse of the Sonoran Desert in Mexico. My name is Carlos Delgado, and back in the spring of 1989, I was running the late graveyard shift through a thick wall of valley fog that wrapped the lonely desert highway in pure white. The desert night was abnormally quiet, broken only by the steady hum of my radial tires against hot asphalt and the sharp crackle of static from my old CB radio. It was precisely 4 a.m., that deadly, quiet hour where exhaustion starts playing dark tricks on a driver's mind, turning distant silhouettes of saguaro cacti into looming figures watching from the shoulder. My eyes felt heavy, burning from hours of staring into thick mist, while amber lights on my instrument panel glowed weakly against the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, a loud burst of static cut through the receiver, making me jump as a rough, panicked voice broke through the frequency, pleading desperately for immediate assistance over Channel 19. The caller spoke with a heavy rasp, claiming his semi-truck had suffered an engine fire and was stranded right at the dark entrance of Junction 7, an abandoned logging trail closed off for 30 years. I glanced down at my radio display and noticed the signal meter bouncing erratically, while the hands on my wristwatch began ticking at a frantic speed, spinning out of control. I knew there was no cellular coverage in this dead zone, and every professional instinct built over 20 years on the asphalt screamed at me to stay on the main interstate and ignore the call. Yet, the raw terror echoing through the speaker was so real that I couldn't bring myself to abandon a fellow trucker in the dark. I took a deep breath, grabbed the gear stick, threw the transmission down into a lower gear, and swung the heavy steering wheel sharply to the right. The big rig bounced aggressively as the tires left the pavement, grinding onto a narrow dirt trail lined with the skeletal remains of dead pine trees reaching into fog like broken fingers. The headlights struggled to cut through thick mist, casting eerie shadows across the overgrown path as I crawled deeper into the silent wilderness. The air grew colder with every 100 yards, the scent of pine replaced by a faint, metallic odor of rust and old petroleum. I pushed the truck through the narrow passage, the branches scraping against metal sides of my trailer with a screech that set my teeth on edge. Up ahead, the fog parted to reveal the wide clearing of Junction 7, but what waited for me in the beam of my high lights was not a single broken-down vehicle needing a jump-start. Stretched across the dusty clearing was a terrifying sight that made my blood run cold, a long, perfectly aligned row of dozens of ancient, rusted semi-trucks, their crushed cabs and smashed windshields preserved in the quiet dark like forgotten monuments to horrific highway disasters. Every single vehicle was parked in absolute precision, locked in place beneath choking fog, hiding secrets buried in Sonoran dirt for decades. I slowed my rig to a complete crawl, my heart pounding violently against my ribs as I realized I had stepped right into the jaw of a trap that had been waiting for someone to answer the call. I held my breath as my truck rolled to a stop before that silent graveyard of rusted iron. The headlights sliced through the mist, illuminating dusty interiors of ancient trucks ahead. My knuckles turned white against the steering wheel as I leaned forward, peering through the glass to check for drivers. What I saw paralyzed me. Inside every semi-truck sat a figure dressed in fading clothes, head snapped back, pale eyes wide open, staring into the fog. Not a single one moved or drew breath. Cold panic rushed down my spine. The voice over the radio wasn't a stranded driver, but a beacon pulling living men into an unmarked cemetery. Before I could shift into reverse, the dead silence shattered with a mechanical roar. The ancient, rusted engines of every truck turned over all at once, coughing thick black exhaust. Headlights slammed on in unison, blinding me with a harsh yellow glare. Skeletal drivers shifted pale hands onto wheels, vacant eyes turning to lock onto mine. I slammed my foot on the gas, grinding gears violently to force my rig backward down the trail, but it was too late. The rusted semis rolled forward in terrifying coordination, heavy steel frames scraping together as they closed the gap. They moved with unnatural speed, blocking the dirt path behind me, forming an unbroken ring of jagged metal, shattered glass, and screaming engines. The circle tightened, rusted bumpers crushing together with deafening metallic crunches, trapping my truck in a cage of dead steel. My radio speaker burst into violent static, and through the noise, dozens of overlapping voices whispered, "Welcome to Junction 7, Carlos, the frequency never closes." As dark fog spilled through my cabin vents and my engine died, the desert swallowed my rig, leaving me trapped in an eternal loop along the dead trails of the Sonoran. The static dissolves into the suffocating industrial stink of sulfur and hot copper grease deep in eastern Texas. My name is Robert Henderson, and in the summer of 1994, I took a high-paying haul from an isolated depot hidden on the dark outskirts of an industrial zone. The cargo consisted of 3 massive steel shipping containers bolted onto my flatbed trailer, each sealed with thick red wax over heavy iron latches. The dispatcher who handed me the manifest looked pale, hands shaking as he gave me paperwork, repeating one rule: no matter what you hear, never break the wax seals, and never look inside. I nodded, tossed my bag in the seat, and pushed my rig onto the pitch-black interstate under a starless sky. For the first 100 miles, the drive was completely uneventful, just the hum of tires and the rhythmic flicker of distance markers. Then, around 2:30 a.m., as I passed a desolate stretch of swampy highway, a faint sound echoed through the wall behind my head. It was a soft metallic tapping inside the middle container, a slow, deliberate clink, clink, clink like fingernails tapping iron. I frowned, telling myself it was just loose chains shifting in the humid air. Within minutes, the tapping evolved into heavy pounding that shook the entire frame of my trailer. Something massive inside was hurling its full weight against steel walls, trying to tear through metal plating with sharp claws. The violent thuds vibrated through my seat, making it nearly impossible to keep the rig steady. Unable to ignore the commotion, I pulled into an abandoned rest stop surrounded by overgrown pines. I grabbed a heavy tire iron, clicked on my flashlight, and stepped into the muggy Texas night. The air smelled of sulfur and stagnant swamp water as I walked along my trailer, boots crunching softly on loose gravel. I reached the middle container and raised my beam to the doors, stopping dead as I saw the red wax seal. The wax was melting, bubbling furiously as if the metal behind it were burning hot, while fresh dark blood dripped down the latch. Driven by terror, I hooked the tire iron under the latch and snapped the warm wax seal in two. The heavy handle swung open with a harsh screech, and a cloud of scalding, copper-scented heat surged out, knocking me onto my back. I scrambled backward in the dirt, shining my beam inside, only to behold a creature straight out of a nightmare. Crouched inside was a tall, emaciated humanoid figure with stretched gray skin, elongated limbs, and bone claws dripping with gore. Its face was featureless except for a wide, toothless maw that split open, emitting a silent screech vibrating through my bones. Before I could scramble up or scream, the entity lunged out with terrifying speed, long cold fingers wrapping around my ankles like iron cuffs. It pulled me backward across the gravel, dragging me into the dark, scalding abyss of the container. The doors slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash, iron latches locking from the outside, sealing me into a rolling tomb of dark steel and blood. The heavy steel container doors lock into place, fading out as the radio signal sweeps across the black, rain-slicked tarmac of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Frank Dawson, and in October of 1999, I was running an overnight freight run along a dark stretch of coastal highway in Washington state. A thick, blinding rain battered against my windshield while heavy ocean fog crawled off the cliff edges, wrapping the dense pine forest around me in sheer blackness. At 1:15 a.m., my high beams caught the silhouette of a woman standing motionless on the flooded shoulder, wearing a soaked blue dress, her dark hair plastered across her face. She held a heavy wooden crate in her arms, staring fixedly at my approaching rig without blinking or shielding her eyes against the blinding halogen headlights. Thinking her car had crashed off the muddy embankment, I hit the air brakes, swung the passenger door open, and called out into the roaring storm for her to climb in. She stepped up the metal ladder without saying a single word, setting the heavy wooden crate onto the cab floor before pulling the door shut tight against the gale. An unbearable, freezing chill instantly filled the cabin, carrying the distinct smell of stagnant ocean water, wet sea kelp, and old, decayed bone. I glanced over at her to ask where she was headed, but my voice died in my throat as I looked at her hands rested quietly over the wooden crate. Her fingers were elongated, greenish-gray, and ending in thick, black aquatic talons, while dark ocean water continuously pooled onto the floorboards from her drenched clothes. Where do you need to drop off that box, ma'am?" I managed to stammer, my hands shaking violently against the leather steering wheel. The woman slowly turned her head toward me, revealing a pale face stripped of skin, her empty eye sockets oozing thick, black brine down her hollow cheeks. Her jaw unhinged with a wet, sickening pop, splitting open far wider than any human skull should, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth dripping with icy sea foam. A gurgling, drowning voice resonated from deep within her hollow chest, echoing straight into my brain, "The box stays with you, Frank, you're taking it all the way down to the bottom of the bay." Before I could stamp on the brakes, her cold, waterlogged hands shot out, wrapping around my wrists like steel clamps and forcing my steering wheel sharply to the right. The 40-ton rig smashed violently through the wooden guardrail, plunging into the black, soundless void of the coastal cliffs toward the roaring ocean below. The sound of crashing ocean waves fades into the low, rhythmic hum of a diesel engine idling in a pitch-black, abandoned rest area along Route 66. My name is David Miller, and back in the freezing winter of 2005, I pulled my semi into an unlit truck stop in the middle of the New Mexico desert to sleep off an 18-hour shift. Around 3 a.m., a soft, deliberate tapping on my driver's side glass woke me from a deep, dreamless sleep. I sat up in the sleeper berth, groggily rubbing my eyes, assuming it was a night guard or another trucker asking to borrow a tire iron. I pulled back the dark privacy curtain, clicked on the dim overhead cab light, and looked down at the door mirror. Standing on the metal step right outside my window was an exact, perfect duplicate of myself, wearing my denim jacket, my boots, and my silver aviator glasses. My breath caught in my throat as the double raised its right hand and tapped 3 times against the glass, its lips moving silently to mimic my exact breathing pattern. It smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched the skin across its cheekbones too far, revealing far too many perfectly straight, gleaming white teeth. It lifted a small, silver truck key from its jacket pocket, the exact duplicate of the key currently sitting in my ignition, and inserted it directly into the outer door lock. The tumblers clicked, the heavy door unlatched, and the icy desert wind howled into the cab as my own face leaned into the dark room, whispering softly, "Thanks for holding the seat, David. I'll take the wheel from here." The desert wind carries the cold echo of David Miller's stolen life away, shifting the frequency into the damp, dense pine wilderness of northern Minnesota. My name is Marcus Vance, and in November of 2012, I was hauling an oversized flatbed load down an isolated 2-lane highway during a heavy, blinding snowstorm. The road was completely silent, surrounded on both sides by endless miles of pitch-black forest where tall timber closed in like a wooden wall. At precisely 2:45 a.m., my dashboard CB radio burst into violent static, cutting through the silence with a high-pitched, agonizing frequency that vibrated straight through my skull. I reached out to switch the radio off, but before my fingers touched the dial, a voice broke through the static, a loud, clear broadcast of my own voice reading my full name, age, and home address. The recording continued, calmly listing the exact speed of my truck, my current oil pressure, and describing every single movement I made inside the locked cabin in real time. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I looked up at my wide rearview mirrors, searching the dark, snow-covered highway behind me for headlights. There was nothing behind my rig, only the endless black void of the blizzard and the thick tracks of my heavy tires melting into the snow. Suddenly, a heavy, metallic thud slammed onto the roof of my sleeper cab, shaking the entire 40-ton rig and making the metal ceiling bow inward under immense weight. I gripped the steering wheel tight, my knuckles turning white as something massive began dragging itself across the roof directly above my head. The sound of heavy, razor-sharp claws scraping against the cold sheet metal sent shivers down my spine, leaving deep, jagged gouges in the iron ceiling. I hit the air brakes hard, bringing the massive truck to a skidding, violent stop on the icy shoulder, grabbing my iron tire wrench from beside the gear shift. The heavy dragging sound on the roof stopped instantly, leaving an absolute, suffocating silence inside the frozen cabin. I looked up at the ceiling, my heart hammering against my ribs, as 5 long, pale bone claws suddenly punched straight down through the steel roof above my seat. A thick, dark fluid began dripping from the puncture holes, burning through the vinyl headliner and filling the air with the sharp, sickening stench of decayed earth and formaldehyde. Before I could unlatch the driver's door to jump into the snow, the radio speaker screamed with a deafening, inhuman roar that shattered every piece of glass in the cab. A pair of wide, glowing milky eyes pressed down through the jagged hole in the ceiling, staring directly into mine as long, icy fingers reached down to coil around my throat. The freezing Minnesota woods dissolve into the scorching, pitch-black silence of the lonely highways cutting across the Nevada desert. My name is Sam Myers, and back in the summer of 2018, I took a late-night shortcut down an unmarked military bypass road marked only by a rusted steel gate. The desert night was dead quiet, the air outside heavy with heat, while my high beams illuminated miles of empty, flat asphalt stretching into nothingness. Around 3:15 a.m., my truck's headlights flickered twice and died completely, plunging the cab into absolute, terrifying darkness while the diesel engine sputtered and seized. I coasted the heavy rig to a stop in the middle of the empty road, pulling the emergency brake handle with a sharp hiss of air. I clicked on my heavy flashlight, unlatched the driver's door, and stepped down onto the warm asphalt to check the engine bay. As I popped the heavy hood, I noticed that every single electrical wire beneath the cover had been cleanly severed, melted as if hit by an intense, white-hot heat. Before I could process what happened, the temperature in the air dropped from scorching desert heat to freezing ice in a matter of seconds. A low, vibrating hum echoed from the sky above, vibrating through the asphalt under my boots and shaking the teeth inside my jaw. I raised my flashlight beam upward, but the light was completely absorbed by a massive, silent shadow hovering directly above my semi-truck. The massive dark shape had no engine noise, no lights, and no reflection. It simply existed, blotting out the stars like an endless wall of void. A thin beam of pale, iridescent light shot down from the center of the structure, striking the roof of my truck and dissolving the thick metal plating like wet paper. Through the opening, long, translucent tendrils descended into the cab, wrapping around the steering wheel, the dashboard, and the sleeper berth, absorbing the entire vehicle into its dark frame. I tried to run into the desert night, but my boots were glued to the road as the pale beam shifted directly onto me, lifting my body weightlessly into the cold, silent dark. The pale beam lifts my weight into the freezing dark of the Nevada night, the highway dissolving as the frequency shifts north toward Northern California. My name is Thomas Hall, and in late 2021, I hauled a timber load down an unlit coastal highway wrapped in thick fog. The narrow asphalt snaked along redwood cliffs, distant Pacific waves echoing from the dark abyss below. At 3:30 a.m., my dashboard GPS flickered, spinning before flashing, rerouting to destination. A route off the highway led into a timber preserve abandoned for half a century. Pine trees leaning inward interlocked their branches above the asphalt like a vaulted ceiling. Air pressure inside the cab plummeted, forcing sharp pain into my eardrums as pine turned to burnt copper and ash. Up ahead, through swirling fog, headlights illuminated an ancient wooden bridge spanning a black ravine. A weathered sign read, "Weight limit, 0 tons. All cargo must be surrendered." I hit the air brakes, bringing my 40-ton rig to a halt on the slick shoulder feet from the entrance, heart hammering. I leaned over the wheel, squinting through rain-streaked glass to gauge if rotten planks could support my trailer. Suddenly, the rig rocked violently as massive weight settled onto the trailer beds behind me. I looked into my side mirrors and watched in horror as translucent shadows crawled out of the dark redwood canopy. They were human-shaped, 8 feet tall with spindly limbs moving with liquid grace, featureless faces glowing faintly. They began clawing at thick steel tie-down chains, snapping heavy iron links with bare hands like brittle plastic. The sound of snapping steel echoed as heavy timber logs were flung effortlessly off the trailer into the ravine. Panicking, I jammed the gear stick into reverse to back out, but drive tires spun uselessly on slick mud. A sudden, freezing tap sounded on the rear sleeper window right behind my head. I slowly turned as the vinyl privacy curtain was pulled aside by a long, pale hand with 5 joints per finger. A glowing, featureless face leaned into the red glow of my cab, its voice echoing inside my brain, "The cargo wasn't enough, Thomas, the rig stays, and so do you." The steering column locked, the gear stick snapped in half, and the bridge collapsed, taking my truck into the silent woods. The forest fades as the frequency sweeps across the empty salt flats of Utah under a dead, moonless sky. My name is Eli Carter, and in midsummer 2024, I ran an empty tanker trailer across a desolate highway stretch. Desert heat radiated off asphalt at 4 a.m., creating shimmering mirages that warped white lines down the road. As I crested a rise, my high beams caught a lone figure standing dead in the middle of my lane. It was an old man in a frayed trucker hat and grease-stained coveralls, standing rigid with his back turned. I hit the horn, sending a loud air blast echoing, but the figure didn't flinch or move to the shoulder. I stomped on the brake pedal, tires screeching as rubber burned, bringing the massive tanker to a halt. "Get off the damn road." I hollered out the window, grabbing my flash lantern. The old man slowly turned around, his neck spun in a full circle, his face looking directly at me over his shoulders. His eyes were solid white, devoid of pupils, his mouth stretched wide in a frozen scream with no tongue. Before I could throw the truck into gear, his body snapped around, sprinting forward to cover 10 feet in a heartbeat. He slammed his hands against the front grille, the heavy impact shattering my radiator in a cloud of scalding steam. Through the white haze, I watched him climb straight up the chrome grille like a spider. He reached the windshield, pressing his distorted face flat against safety glass, whispering, "There are no exits on this road, driver, you've been driving in circles for 30 years. I looked down in terror as odometer numbers began spinning backward, unwinding miles and years until the engine dissolved into rust, leaving me in a skeletal frame of steel amidst endless salt. The endless salt dissolves into the heavy, humid shadows of the deep south, where the frequency settles onto a desolate stretch of backwoods asphalt cutting through the Louisiana bayou. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and back in the crisp autumn of 2025, I was hauling a sealed flatbed load through a pitch-black stretch of parish highway lined with ancient, moss-draped oak trees. The night air was stifling, thick with moisture that clung to the windshield, while the endless repetition of dark trees made every mile feel identical to the last. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the thick fog rising off the black swamp waters turned a strange, shimmering crimson, thick enough to swallow the powerful halogen beams of my headlights. My dashboard instruments began to act erratic, the speedometer needle spinning wildly between 0 and 80 while the radio hummed with a low, rhythmic heartbeat. The unnatural pulse vibrated straight through the floorboards and into my bones, filling the enclosed cab with an oppressive, heavy pressure that made breathing difficult. Up ahead, standing directly in the center of the narrow two-lane road, was a towering wooden structure, a crude, rickety archway constructed entirely out of bleached animal bones and rusted iron chains. Suspended from the center of the archway was a massive copper bell, swinging back and forth in complete silence despite the sudden, howling gale that whipped through the trees. I slammed my foot onto the brake pedal, the tires screeching violently against the wet pavement as the heavy rig skidded to a halt just feet before the bony threshold. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I grabbed my heavy iron tire wrench from the passenger seat, my knuckles turning white around the cold, forged metal. I leaned over the steering wheel, my breath fogging the glass as I stared into the red mist, desperately looking for any sign of life or an opening to turn the rig around. Before I could force the gear stick into reverse, the crimson fog rushed into the cabin through the heater vents, smelling overpoweringly of copper, stagnant river water, and fresh graveyard earth. The dark swamp on either side of the road suddenly erupted with movement as dozens of tall, gaunt figures with elongated limbs stepped out from behind the weeping oaks. Their skin was black as pitch, their faces completely covered by porcelain masks painted with wide, weeping red eyes that seemed to catch the pale glow of my dashboard lights. They moved in eerie, synchronized silence, sliding across the mud without making a sound, quickly surrounding the cab and pressing their long, wooden fingers against the cold glass of my windshield. With a horrifying unison, they began tracing strange, circular symbols onto the glass, leaving oily black handprints that slowly began to dissolve the heavy safety window like liquid acid. The heavy copper bell above the archway finally struck, producing a sound so impossibly deep and resonant that it shattered my side mirrors, sending shards of reflective glass raining down onto the floorboards. The shockwave knocked me sideways against the sleeper berth curtain, my ears ringing violently as the pitch-black sky above opened up with a torrential downpour of black, oily rain. A deep, echoing voice vibrated from beneath the floorboards, as if the swamp itself were speaking directly into my head through the vibrating metal frame. "This road has no end, Arthur, every cargo brought here becomes part of the foundation." The asphalt beneath my tires softened into deep, black mire, and the heavy 40-ton rig began to sink, inch by inch, swallowing the rear axles, the engine bay, and the chassis into the hungry earth. Water mixed with black mud began pooling around my boots, rising fast as the electrical system short-circuited, killing the headlights and plunging the cab into total, pitch-black darkness. I clawed frantically at the chrome door handle, pushing with all my strength, but the locks fused solid under a thick layer of black rust, completely sealing the cab from the outside. Outside, the porcelain-masked figures pressed their faces against the melting windshield, watching silently as the dark, thick earth rose past the glass, completely swallowing the cabin. I drew one last, desperate breath of stale air as the dark mud sealed over the roof, burying my truck, my cargo, and my scream beneath the silent swamp forever. The suffocating black mud of the bayou dissolves into a blinding, icy blizzard sweeping across the desolate expanse of northern Alaska. My name is Victor Vance, and in the freezing midwinter of 2026, I was hauling an industrial drill rig down the Dalton Highway, a brutal, isolated ribbon of ice cut through miles of frozen tundra. The wind howled at gale force, whipping whiteout snow across my windshield while the thermometer on my dashboard registered a deadly 40 degrees below zero. At 2:40 a.m., my CB radio crackled with heavy static, followed by a frantic voice screaming through the receiver, "Clear the lane. It's right behind you. It doesn't stop for the storm." I grabbed the mic to respond, but the radio line died instantly into a sharp, piercing whine that rattled the frozen glass of my cab. I glanced into my heated side mirrors and saw a pair of massive, blinding white spotlights cutting through the whiteout about half a mile behind me. The headlights were closing the distance with unnatural speed, moving at a velocity no heavy vehicle could maintain on sheer black ice. As the vehicle drew closer, the sound of its engine echoed over the storm, not the roar of a diesel motor, but a rhythmic, metallic screeching like thousands of iron blades grinding together. I stomped on the gas, trying to keep my 40-ton rig steady on the slippery grade, but the blinding lights swept up directly behind my trailer, illuminating my entire cabin in a harsh, cold glare. I looked into my rearview mirror and gasped in horror at the monstrosity tailgating me. It was an ancient, skeletal snowplow made of blackened, rusted iron, its massive front V-blade jagged and coated in thick, frozen layers of dark, arterial blood. There was no driver inside the cab, only a glowing, pulsating mass of blue icy veins wrapped tightly around the steering wheel like frozen roots. The phantom plow surged forward, slamming its jagged iron blade directly into the rear bumper of my trailer with a deafening, metallic crash that sent sparks flying into the blizzard. The impact snapped my trailer's kingpin, causing my load to jackknife violently across the narrow ice road and plunging my tractor unit headfirst into a deep, snow-filled ravine. My rig rolled twice, crashing heavily onto its side at the bottom of the embankment, the structural frame groaning as the windshield shattered into 1,000 icy shards. Trapped in my seatbelt, bleeding and freezing, I watched through the broken windshield as the massive iron plow ground to a halt at the top of the ridge, idling quietly in the storm. The driver's side door of the plow creaked open, and a tall figure stepped out onto the ice, draped in a frozen, tattered parka that whipped wildly in the wind. It walked down the steep snowbank with unnatural, jerky movements, its heavy boots making no sound against the fresh snow. It reached the overturned cab, leaning its head down through the shattered windshield frame, revealing a face made entirely of jagged, crystal ice with two pitch-black voids where its eyes should have been. It extended a long, frostbitten hand, its skin cracking open like glass, and pressed a single, freezing finger directly against my forehead. A wave of absolute, paralyzing cold rushed through my veins, instantly freezing the blood in my heart as its hollow voice echoed inside my dying mind, "The ice never releases what it claims, Victor, welcome to the Hall." My breath crystallized in my lungs, my vision clouded over with thick frost, and the Arctic wilderness swallowed my rig, leaving me frozen in time beneath the silent, dancing lights of the northern sky. The Arctic ice dissolves into a blinding, featureless fog hovering over a forgotten stretch of coastal asphalt along the main shoreline. My name is Harold Vance, and in November of 2026, I was hauling an empty box trailer down an isolated peninsula road surrounded by towering, dead pines and jagged ocean cliffs. The salt air was heavy and cold, thick enough to cling to my windshield like grease, while the endless roar of the Atlantic battered against the rocks below. At 3:05 a.m., my headlights flickered twice before dying completely, leaving only the dim, ghostly glow of my dashboard display to cut through the oppressive dark. I hit the emergency hazards, but the flasher relay clicked uselessly, completely dead, while my diesel engine sputtered into a silent, coasting stall. I guided the heavy 40-ton rig onto the soft shoulder, pulling the air brake lever with a loud, echoing hiss that died quickly in the dense fog. Grabbing my heavy steel flashlight, I unlatched the driver's side door and stepped down onto the slick, wet gravel to inspect the dead alternator beneath the hood. The air outside was dead quiet, no wind, no ocean waves, no insects, only an absolute, suffocating silence that made my own heartbeat sound like thunder inside my chest. As I popped the hood latches, a pale yellow beam of light cut through the thick fog down the road ahead, illuminating the silhouette of an ancient, weathered toll booth spanning both lanes. The structure hadn't been there when I drove this exact route 3 hours prior. Its wooden frame was rotten, covered in thick barnacles and wet sea kelp as if dredged straight from the ocean floor. A single oil lantern hung from the rusted iron boom arm, swinging back and forth with a slow, rhythmic creak that vibrated through my teeth. I shined my flashlight beam inside the narrow glass booth and froze as the beam illuminated a figure sitting motionless behind the cracked window. It was dressed in an antique naval uniform, soaked in dark ocean water, its skin stretched tight and leathery over a skeletal frame that showed exposed cheekbones and jaw. Slowly, the figure raised a gaunt, waterlogged hand and tapped 3 times against the glass, pointing a long, bone-white finger directly at my chest. A low, gurgling sound rose from the booth's rusted speaker horn, echoing with the wet slosh of water filling a drowning lungs. "The toll is due, Harold, no passage without a soul." I turned to run back to my cab, but my boots sank into the asphalt as if it were fresh tar, pinning my legs to the dark road. The rusted iron boom arm smashed downward, shattering the hood of my semi-truck in a cloud of hot steam, while translucent hands reached up from the black asphalt beneath my feet, dragging my weight down into the cold, silent depths of the fog forever. The coastal mist evaporates into the scorching, pitch-black night of an unmapped backroad cutting through the dry brush of southern Arizona. My name is Ray Miller, and in the heat of July 2026, I took a detour off the interstate to bypass an 80-mile traffic jam with a flatbed load of steel coils. The desert was a void, empty and silent, with the hot tarmac radiating heat that made the horizon shimmer under a moonless sky. At 3:45 a.m., my high beams caught a lone hitchhiker standing by a rusted mile marker, a young girl wearing a faded floral dress, holding a worn leather suitcase. Against my better judgment, I slowed the heavy rig down, pulling over onto the dusty shoulder to see if she needed help out in the desolate heat. "Where are you headed, miss?" I called out through the open passenger window, keeping the engine idling. She didn't answer. She simply opened the door and climbed up the steps into the cool air of the cabin, setting her suitcase carefully at her feet. As she pulled the heavy door shut, the ambient temperature inside the cab plummeted, freezing the condensation on my dashboard vents into thin sheets of ice. I looked over at her, and my breath caught in my throat as I saw her face under the overhead cab light. Her features were perfectly symmetrical, but her eyes were completely gone, replaced by 2 smooth, polished silver coins stamped with an ancient, forgotten currency. She turned her coin-filled sockets toward me, her jaw splitting open along her cheeks to reveal an endless, dark void that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. "Thank you for the ride, driver," she whispered in a voice that sounded like thousands of whispering voices speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for a new engine." Before I could touch the door handle, her cold, bone-dry hands locked around the steering wheel, turning the heavy rig sharply toward a sheer canyon drop-off into the black desert below. The sheer drop into the desert canyon dissolves into an endless ribbon of cracked asphalt stretching across the desolate Midwestern plains of Kansas. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and in August of 2026, I was running an empty refrigerator trailer back to Chicago under a heavy, moonless midnight sky. The flat prairie stretched out endlessly in every direction, silent and featureless, with only the hum of my diesel engine breaking the cold solitude of the night. At 3:15 a.m., my high beams caught a strange structure standing on the shoulder up ahead, a wooden billboard covered in peeling black paint. As my truck drew closer, bold white lettering began to bleed through the dark paint, forming a sentence in real time: "Welcome home, Arthur. You arrived 10 minutes ago." I frowned, letting off the accelerator as a chill crept up my spine, chalking the bizarre message up to fatigue and long hours on the open road. I glanced down at my digital clock, 3:15 a.m., and then looked back out at the highway, only to see the exact same billboard appear in my high beams again, 200 yards ahead. The white text on the board had changed, pulsing in the glare of my halogens. "You looked at the clock again. Stop caring about time." Panic flared in my chest as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, accelerating the 40-ton rig to 80 miles per hour to put the bizarre illusion behind me. Yet, every 30 seconds, like clockwork, the same billboard flashed past my window, each time displaying real-time details of my reactions inside the cab. "Your knuckles are turning white on the wheel. Your heart rate is 140 BPM. You are trying to pray, but no one is listening on this stretch." Sweat poured down my neck as I frantically tried to turn the steering wheel to pull off onto the median, but the wheel was completely frozen, blocking the rig in a straight line. I checked my side mirrors and gasped in absolute terror. My trailer had vanished completely, replaced by an endless line of identical semi-truck cabs coupled bumper to bumper behind me into the horizon. Every single cab in the infinite train was identical to mine, and inside every illuminated driver's seat sat a copy of myself, staring wide-eyed with terror into their own rear-view mirrors. A high-pitched tone began echoing from the speakers, slowly modulating until it formed a clear voice. "You left the highway 3 years ago, Arthur. You've just been reviewing the final mile." The speedometer needle snapped off its dial, the road beneath my tires dissolved into a liquid void, and my truck fell forward into an infinite loop of headlights and warning signs, doomed to drive the same endless minute for eternity. The endless Midwestern loop shatters like fragile glass, reforming into a dark, flooded mountain pass cutting through the deep valleys of West Virginia. My name is Mason Cross, and in late August of 2026, I was navigating a narrow logging road during a torrential downpour that turned the asphalt into a rushing river of mud. The mountain cliffs towered over my rig on the right, while a steep, rocky ravine dropped off into pitch-black nothingness on my left. At 3:40 a.m., a bright red flare ignited in the middle of the flooded road 50 yards ahead, bathing the sweeping rain and thick pine trees in a bloody glow. I stomped on the air brakes, the tires skidding on the mud before bringing the flatbed trailer to a heavy stop right before the burning flare. Standing behind the red flame was a road worker dressed in a bright yellow reflective vest and a hard hat, holding a stop sign firmly in his gloved hand. I rolled down my driver's window slightly, the icy rain splashing against my face as I yelled over the roar of the storm, "Is the pass washed out ahead?" The worker didn't speak. He simply raised his free hand and pointed his finger straight down at the mud beneath my front tires. I shined my heavy flashlight down at the road and froze as the beam illuminated what lay beneath the rain water. The asphalt wasn't flooded with water, but with thick, dark, human blood. I snapped my flashlight beam back up to the worker, my breath hitching in my throat as he slowly removed his hard hat and lifted his face into the red light of the flare. Where his face should have been, there was only a flat, smooth sheet of rusted metal, bolted directly into his neck with heavy iron rivets. Etched into the center of the metal plate was my truck's license plate number, along with the exact date and time of my birth. The figure flipped his stop sign around to reveal the reverse side, which read in bold, glowing red letters, Terminus. Before I could throw the transmission into reverse, the mountain wall beside me groaned, unleashing a massive avalanche of dark earth, twisted iron, and skeletal remains that buried the cab instantly, crushing the steel frame like an empty aluminum can and silencing the mountain forever. The dark avalanche and crushed steel of the mountain pass dissolve into an endless, frozen darkness where the rules of reality no longer apply. My name is Frank Coleman, and in the late autumn of 2026, I was hauling a double-trailer load of heavy machinery along an unmapped service road cutting through the dark wilderness of Wyoming. I was a man who didn't believe in ghost stories or road legends. 20 years behind the wheel of a 40-ton rig had taught me that the only real dangers on the highway were worn tires, black ice, and falling asleep at the wheel. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the violent storm outside died down instantly, the howling wind dropping into a suffocating, absolute silence that made the heavy rumble of my diesel engine sound like a muffled whisper. My dashboard displays didn't just flicker, they froze completely, the digital screens turning into a stark, solid white light while my GPS map vanished, replaced by a single line of glowing text, "End of line." I looked through my windshield and watched in disbelief as the asphalt ahead dissolved into a road made of cold, solidified static, suspended over a bottomless abyss where discarded street signs, broken speedometers, rusted chrome bumpers, and shattered windshields floated like lost debris in deep space. Panicked, I stomped on the air brake pedal with all my weight, bringing the heavy double-trailer to a sudden, screeching halt at the edge of the void. I reached for the door handle to escape, but as I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel, my blood ran cold, my skin was turning translucent, my fingers slowly dissolving into fine, glowing silver dust that drifted into the air of the cab. Up ahead, standing at the absolute terminus of the static road, a gigantic radio tower forged from blackened iron pierced the endless dark, its massive spire stretching infinitely upward into the void. A giant, glowing frequency dial at the base of the tower was spinning wildly, tuning through the frantic screams, screeching air brakes, metallic crashes, and final whispered words of every lost trucker who had ever disappeared on the open road. An invisible, irresistible force pulled my truck forward across the bridge of static, bringing the rig to its final stop directly under a harsh, white spotlight at the base of the tower. The driver's side door swung open on its own, and as I stepped out onto the cold, humming pavement, I realized I was no longer alone in the dark. Surrounding the tower were hundreds of silent, glowing silhouettes, the drivers, the hitchhikers, and the forgotten souls from every stretch of road, standing shoulder to shoulder in absolute, eerie stillness. They weren't moving, and they weren't attacking, they were simply waiting, their hollow eyes fixed on a chrome studio microphone standing on an iron pedestal right beneath the iron tower. My dissolving body moved toward the pedestal as if completing a route I had been assigned long ago, my hand rising to grip the cold chrome of the mic. As my fingers touched the metal, a surge of infinite memories flooded my mind, every highway, every midnight storm, every last scream, and every lost hall echoing through my soul at once. I leaned into the microphone, my voice vibrating through the void and echoing out across every radio frequency on every dark highway in the world. This is Frank Coleman. To anyone still driving alone in the night, the road ends here, but the broadcast never stops. The giant dial on the tower locked into place with a heavy iron clunk, the static cleared into pure, silent resonance, and as my body fully turned into silver dust, the engine finally cut out, leaving the endless road in absolute peace. The silver dust of Frank Coleman's final broadcast settles into a vast, absolute vacuum, a place where highways, states, and coordinates cease to exist entirely. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and if you remember my voice from the bayou or the endless Kansas loop, you might wonder how I am speaking again after the earth and mud claimed my truck. The truth is, none of us ever truly left the road, we were simply chapters written into a ledger that was never meant to be closed. When the radio tower's frequency dial locked into place, the static didn't just clear, it inverted, pulling every ghost, every phantom rig, and every lost driver backward out of the dark and into the blinding light of the primary source. The endless void split open, reforming into a final, colossal stretch of highway, an 8-lane superhighway made of polished, black obsidian that stretched beneath a blood-red sky. There were no trees here, no mountains, no fog, and no towns, only a straight, unbroken path leading directly toward an immense, towering gateway built entirely from the fused bumpers and twisted frames of every semi-truck that ever vanished on the American asphalt. At the base of the gate stood a massive, iron-framed control room, its walls lined with thousands of glowing analog dials, glowing vacuum tubes, and tape reels spinning at impossible speeds. This was the master terminal, the place where every late-night broadcast was recorded, transmitted, and looped into eternity for millions of tired listeners parked in the dark. I stood beside Frank Coleman, Victor Vance, Mason Cross, and the hundreds of other drivers who had walked out of the static, our physical forms restored by the sheer pressure of the final signal. We weren't afraid anymore. The terror of the midnight drives, the phantom hitchhikers, and the collapsing bridges had burned away, replaced by the cold, heavy clarity of understanding. We were the archive. We were the road. Suddenly, the massive speakers mounted above the iron gateway crackled to life, emitting a long, deafening burst of white noise that shook the black obsidian beneath our boots. A deep, synthesized voice, the very voice that had whispered inside our dashboards at 3:33 a.m. across every chapter, echoed across the empty plane. The transmission is complete. The channel is locked. All routes have converged. A heavy, automated gear engaged deep within the earth, and the colossal iron gateway slowly began to swing inward, revealing a blinding, infinite horizon of pure white light. There were no more miles to log, no more cargo to haul, and no more detours into the dark. We climbed back into our restored rigs, every chrome grille gleaming under the red sky, every diesel engine roaring to life with a synchronized, window-rattling thunder that chased away the last remnants of the night. I shifted my transmission into high gear, gripped the steering wheel, and looked across the obsidian highway at the endless convoy of brothers rolling beside me into the light. We pressed our foot down on the accelerator together, driving straight through the gates and off the edge of the world, leaving the midnight highways quiet, empty, and finally at rest.